Now, creating gradients in Illustrator is very much the same as Photoshop and InDesign with a few subtle differences. So let's create a cool one to use for one of our digital assets, which is going to be an HD DVD menu design or interstitial backdrop. So what we'll do, just to be safe, let's lock our layer here and just make sure everything's deselected. And what we're going to do is go up to the File menu and say New from Template. Remember that we saved our digital campaign assets as a separate template file, so we can now pull that up. So go ahead and select Digital Marketing Pieces RGB from the templates folder and hit new. Now you remember when we set this up, we had a large HD TV screen over here on the left hand side. That's precisely what we're going to work with here. Now we want to make sure that we have a black background that is already set to the full size here of our document. So let's go ahead and bring up our rulers. Just right click on there or control click on the PC and make sure that we are set to pixels, okay? And then we'll come over here to the rectangle tool and make sure that we change our fill and stroke colors accordingly. So at this point, if we do Shift X, that will change our fill into black, okay? Now we can check, because the last time we were in a document, we were in CMYK, so let's come over to our color panel and make sure we are viewing RGB, and we're at 0 on all three. That's perfect. Whilst we're here, we can click on the stroke icon and just say none, okay? So positioning it in the upper left-hand side, we have our Smart Guide still active, so we can just click and drag straight the way down, and you can see our full size is 1920 by 1080. Now, as always, I'm going to go back to the main selection tool here, and we want to apply a gradient. Now, there's a quick keyboard shortcut for that. I just want to make sure, again, that we are looking at our fill icon here. But if you look down just underneath that, where we have our fill and we have none, in the middle is gradient. The keyboard shortcut for applying a default gradient to a selected object is simply the period key, or the full stop as we call it back in England, okay? So you see our default gradient has now been applied, and the gradient panel over here on the right hand side has now become active. We've got a white and a black swatch and something called the midpoint, all right? Now the palette on its own obviously has a lot more options, so let's come over to the right hand side and say show options from the flyout here, and you'll see a few more items we can play with. The first thing we'll do is we'll change the angle here. Let's maybe drop that to 90 degrees, so we have black at the top and white at the bottom, all right? And you can see a lot of other things can be adjusted in here, such as the color and the positions and everything else. But Illustrator actually has an additional option called the Gradient Annotator, and this is actually very cool. If you just hit G on your keyboard, you can see a graphic has now appeared across the height of your design, okay? And that's basically the Gradient Annotator, which is showing us the same information. The colors are here, we have our midpoint down here, and it also defines the angle and the length. So those are things that we can adjust, but what we want to do is play around with the color. So I'm just going to move this into an area where we can see it in more detail. So if we position our cursor, say, over the bottom here, we can see a white swatch. If we go ahead and double click on that, you'll see we bring up essentially our swatches panel, which is pretty cool. So we can either switch here between the default color panel and make changes, or we can come down and choose a swatch which exists inside our swatches panel. So these two things are available. That's all well and good. So what we really want to do is make sure that the color of this one, I'm just going to use the default color mix here, and I'm going to come up here and choose RGB. So it's kind of like we have all of the color palettes in this one single option. And I'm going to make sure that we choose default black, okay? Very straightforward. Now coming back over, in this case, let's come over to the panel. We can now see that that has updated. We've got our black swatch here, which is at the bottom. Let's give this a try. Hold down your Option key or the Alt key, and you can in fact do this on the Annotator as well, but we'll do it over here just so we can mix things up. Hold down your Option key and click on this swatch and drag, and you'll see, as you do with anything else in Illustrator, Option drag creates a copy. So now what we have is a second color, or essentially a third one here in the middle. If we double click on that, we can now change its color and have a 3-color gradient. So what we're trying to do with this gradient is create a backdrop that almost looks like a horizon, something that's lit, you know, like a studio backdrop or something, which I think will be very simple and subtle for our DVD backdrop. So in here, what we could do is go back essentially maybe to grayscale in this case, and we'll just tint it back a little bit just to make it slightly gray. Now you can go ahead, even if you wanted to make it slightly warm, in fact, let's do that. Let's go to RGB. Go back down to default black, and then if you wanted to maybe just increase the red a little bit, you can see a red glow appearing in the background there. Let's maybe just knock a bit of green in to make it a little bit more orange, and maybe a bit blue just to cool it down, okay? So play around with that as much as you want. This is basically our third color, which sits here in the middle. Now, as well as having the colors, you'll see that we also have these midpoints, and that's basically the smooth blend between one color and the next. Well, those can be moved around to harshen that gap. So the first color has more movement to it or more area that covers, and the blend between this point and the next color gets much shorter, therefore much harder, all right? Now again, like I said, this could also be done over here. If we come down to the annotator, we can see our midpoint is right here, and also the swatch color is right here. So if you wanted to, we could move this up so our highlight sits a little higher in the background. Then we can come down to the midpoint and drag this up, and you'll see that that edge is getting harder, which looks more now like we have a horizon line. So really very cool that all this can be done very simply using a mixture of two different palettes. And I think this gradient annotator is actually very, very powerful. Now, once we've got that, what we should do is save this document, because we are going to work with other items in here, and I think we should save our work so far. So I'm going to come back to the main selection tool, go to the File menu, and choose Save As, all right? And make sure we save it down to the desktop, and we'll simply call this Digital Campaign, so it lines up against our print campaign. Go ahead and hit Save, and just hit OK in the next dialog box.